The Joyful Friar podcast is made possible by the generous support of our friends. To support the podcast, please visit nathan-castle.com and donate today. Hi, this is Father Nathan. Welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. Today, I'm going to be introducing a new trilogy. That is a story from one of the three Afterlife interrupted books, in this case, book 2. We divide that into telling a story in the first part of the trilogy. We do what's called compassionate response to that story in the second segment, and then spiritual practice that might be suggested from the circumstances of that story. So today, I'm going to be doing a story that is at the end of book 2. It pertains to a suicide. So fair warning, if that topic is too delicate for you, you're forewarned. I didn't include any stories of suicide in book 1, in part because I just didn't feel led to, and I was not quite sure how to bring those stories into the public. I would never want to make suicide seem an attractive option for anybody that might have ideation that moves that way. On the other hand, I do believe that everyone gets the help they need in the afterlife. I've certainly seen that over many years in doing the work I do. Anyway, this story is near the end of book 2. In fact, we made it a special section, and I believe the Holy Spirit guided it. It happened that about 5 years ago now, I received a dream in the way that I'm accustomed to receiving them, coming in the night. And this one was, the visuals were of an American city that I thought was in the Midwest. I even thought I wonder if it's St. Louis, but I don't know that the city was that important to the story in the end. But some city, and it had buildings that were between 100 150 years old that I thought were grand and kind of elegant, but in bad repair. And part of me just wanted to fix them. But in the story, there began to be 2 separate stories. One of them about a young woman who was the vocalist in what was otherwise an all-male big band group from maybe the late 30s or early 40s. And then there was another story that that story had its own way of playing out, and I'm not going to go into detail about that because this podcast is really about the second part of it. I was in a building that was about 6 stories tall. It seemed like a building that probably had retail, on the ground floor, like it was in a downtown area, and then maybe some offices in the second, third, fourth floors, and maybe the upper 2 might have been a hotel. And I was in an elevator. There was a man getting into the elevator, and at the last second before the doors closed, I felt like I should get in with him, and I did. And then once I was in the elevator with him, it collapsed. It dropped in a way that would probably mean death. And I woke up. Well, as with all of these stories, I write them down and then make an appointment with prayer partners where when we meet, we go into protected prayer with St. Michael the Archangel, with Mother Mary, and a host of different saints and angels to make sure that we're safe. And then we allow the people to speak. Usually it's through me to a prayer partner and tell us what's going on. Well, this one felt like a diptych, like one of those hinged paintings. You sometimes see them in churches where there'll be, for example, in a Catholic church, maybe St. Mary on one side and Joseph on the other. They're a married couple, they're a pair, and so they're 2 different paintings of them, but they're hinged in the middle, and they each have their own space. Well, this dream felt like that, but we're only dealing with the second part, One was a woman and one was a man. We're going to deal with the man this time. When we did get to talk to him, we discovered that we never did really get his name properly. But what we discovered was that he was a person who was in financial services in the 1920s and who was very much affected by the great crash, the stock market crash of 1929 that brought on about a decade of Great Depression. Well, I'd studied that period of history, and one of the iconic things about it was formerly wealthy people jumping out of windows, taking their life by jumping out of a window. And uh, as we got to talk to him, he didn't really give us his name, and that wasn't essential. That, we can have a conversation without necessarily knowing the person's name. We learned about him that he had been in financial services. He was married and had 3 small children at home. He had what he thought was a good livelihood and a well-constructed life when this happened. He said that he didn't lose his fortune overnight like the way that some of those Depression era stories played out. It's just that his livelihood began to shrivel. For one thing, people who previously had a lot of money to manage didn't anymore, so they didn't need a money manager. And people who still did have money had not as much confidence in financial management as they had before the crash. So his livelihood began to shrivel in on him. There began to be pressure from his employers that he had better bring in new customers or his job was on the line. He began to feel increasing pressure, and some of that played out in his home life. He maybe was working longer hours. There was stress over paying bills, fighting with his wife, kids crying. He explained to us that it wasn't all at once, but things began to get more difficult and more difficult as time went on. He told us that, well, he described how he did take his life in the end. He said that things got more and more difficult, and he hardly ever went to the upper floors of his building because it was a hotel and a bar, or actually he said a really nice restaurant that included a bar. He said he had been up there to the bar a few times to entertain a client, but that's about all. But that as it seemed like life was closing in on him, that one day he just decided, you know what, I think I'm going to go upstairs to the bar and have a drink. And somewhere along the line, he formed the thought, these hotel rooms, you don't have to pay the bill until the morning. What if you're not there in the morning? So he formed that idea that he might take his life by jumping. And then he said, you know what? I didn't really absolutely ever just settle on that as a certainty that I would do. But he said, I was beginning to think more and more in that direction. And I went up to the bar and I ordered a drink. And then I had that drink. And then the bartender said, can I refill that for you? And he said, you know what? I said yes. And when I did, I knew that was when I was going to do it. I wasn't even going to pay the bar bill. Uh, and I guess he already had the hotel room, because he said, I went from the bar to the hotel room door and from the door to the window. So that was that. So I hadn't dealt with one quite like that before, but that was the short story. If you followed this podcast and these wild and woolly stories that I tell that are my reality, my truth, we never get contacted by people in the night unless they're ready to make an important afterlife passage. They've worked through some of what their difficulties were. They've come to some truth. They have gotten help that they needed at the time of their sudden and violent passing, and they're ready to move on to a next space, something better. Well, we helped him do that, and the person who came for him initially was somebody that I was surprised to see in that context. I'd seen him before. In this world that I live in, sometimes the way that these wounded souls are helped is that somebody of some celebrity, some notoriety comes for them, and it can boost them. I give the example sometimes of the way that, like during the college football bowl season, the college team comes to town, and then they're shown in the days in advance of their game visiting in a children's hospital. They go in uniform, and little kids are excited that this football player wants to, visit them. A lot of celebrities lend their fame to charitable causes and stuff. So it's really not that strange on this plane anyway, that celebrities sometimes show up to help people who are having some kind of trouble. I've just found that they do that on the other side as well. The celebrity that showed up for this man was John Jacob Astor, I think the fourth, the one who died on the Titanic. He at the time of the sinking of the Titanic, something like 14 or 1,500 people drowned that day. But the way that the story got told in the press was that he was the wealthiest man in the world, and how ironic that he would, drown in his top hat and tails. That's the way that story played out in the media. Well, he's shown up to help people that drowned any number of times. I've gotten used to him being a sometimes collaborator. But here he showed up not for somebody who drowned, but for this man who had jumped to his death. But he kind of he said something like, well, if I hadn't drowned on the Titanic, maybe I would have lived another couple of decades, and I'd have been around for that stock market crash. And maybe if I had, and I'd lost all my money, maybe I would have found that window ledge just as attractive as you did. So he had a kind of a wry sense of humor and a way of identifying with this fellow and just saying, I got you. I'll take it from here. So I love that part about this work, that whether there's somebody well-known or they're not, doesn't matter. Somebody always shows up to help these people make a gentle movement from, I think of us as being the discharge staff in some sort of a clinic or medical facility, somewhere where there's been healing happening, and it's happened to the point where the person no longer needs this place and is ready to go on to something better. So that's the way that played out. We never tell these stories in a book or on a podcast, anyway public, without going back to the person and asking permission to use their story. And so we, again, go back into protective prayer to do that. As I mentioned, I'd never told a suicide story in public, and I was kind of grateful that these people, both the woman that I mentioned earlier and this man who jumped, they were from probably the early 1930s, or sometime in the 30s anyway, so that even anybody that might have survived them has probably since died. I wouldn't have been possibly ripping open an old wound among survivors. Anyway, when we did go back and ask him if we could use his story, we got a little bit of a follow-up, like we often do. He had then my prayer partner, who was speaking to him, asked for a name and said, you could make one up if you want, but I'd like to have something to call you beside. We were calling him Leaper, and who wants to be defined by, the way that they died? So he didn't really offer a name, but he started thinking of first names, male first names that might have something to do with rising, with getting back up. He knew very well that he had fallen to his death, but he said, there's something about me now that's not falling anymore, that's not on the bottom. I've moved upward. And my prayer partner said, well, what about Bob? Like a cork that bobs, when you're fishing and you have a cork, the fish pulls it underwater, but then eventually it pops back up to the surface. So we decided on Bob. Well, he mentioned that, his death has been a long while ago now, but he's been working on stuff. He knows that, he left a wife and children behind, and that there's still more work to be done around that. He mentioned that he had made everything worse by beginning to drink. There was two things about that. One of them, of course, is being intoxicated doesn't help much of anything. And his wife was annoyed that he would come home tipsy or drunk, and she'd say, where did you get the money to buy that alcohol? I thought we had agreed that we were going to pay this bill. So he still had those things to work through, which really weren't pertinent to the help that we were giving him. We just have our little part to play. But he was saying, I'm beginning to understand better the truth of what my life was like then. And he said, I didn't actively, positively choose to take my life. It's just things got out of control. And so anyway, he's still working through that. But the way that this story played out, on the one hand, in this ministry that I've been invited into, there's a happy ending. And then on the other hand, when we're eternal, what does ending mean? I write books, and so I know that I come to the end of a chapter, or sometimes I come to the end of a book, but life goes on, and I still have other things to do. And that's kind of the way that I see Bob and his story. He gave us what happened. He gave us more in a second conversation with him about what had the trajectory that he's on, that's upward and moving towards greater truth. But there's still much more of his story to be told, and I don't necessarily have to be involved in that. I'm 68 years old, and I wonder how long I'll live on this earth. And after I pass from here, I know that I'll survive my death. And one of the things that I would like to do with some part of my eternity is to do little follow-ups, ask about people and find out what happened after that, see if there's anything I can do later. But for right now, that's the story of what we called Leaper Bob. And next week, we'll go into greater detail about a compassionate response to his story. And then after that, kind of spiritual practices that might arise from it. But for now, I'm grateful that you've given me the attention that you have. Remember that I'm always praying for you, whether you listen to this or, watch the YouTube, whether you're listening or viewing. I want you to know that I pray for you on a regular basis. When I do, I ask that the Holy Spirit find its way into whatever parts of you are loneliest or in most of need of healing. And I'm faithful to that practice. So anyway, that's it for now. This is Father Nathan Castle. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. God bless you. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Joyful Friar. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. God bless.